welcome to the latest webinar in our Engineerica Education Keynote series, our webinar for the month of August. We're very pleased to be bringing you this complimentary presentation. For those of you who are new to us, Engineerica specializes in academic center management systems for higher education. You might be familiar with our software applications, which include AccuTrack, Academia, and AccuCampus. And of course, I want to give a special welcome to any Engineerica clients who are joining us today. And for those of you who are not yet clients, I want to let you know that there is still time. We are offering a complimentary fall trial of our most popular center management system, Academia. This gives you the opportunity to use Academia for an entire semester risk-free to see if it helps make management of your center and data collection easier. You'll have access to features such as our assigning kiosks, our appointment making tools, our surveys, lots of different features that can make management of your center easier. So if that's something you're interested, you can send me an email at rachelc@engineerica.com, and I will paste that into the chat in just a moment. We started the Keynote series for our clients and contacts who wanted to learn more about best practices and trends in higher education. Each month, we feature a distinguished speaker to talk about hot topics in the academic support field. Our next Keynote will be in September. We are still finalizing details for that, so keep an eye on your emails and on our social media channels for an announcement for when we open up registration for that, which should be within the next week or so. So a quick introduction to myself. I'm Rachel Cook. I'm a client success manager with Engineerica. I was previously a learning center manager for 6 years. So like you, I am very passionate about higher education and student success. And I also have with me Justin Virasamy, who is one of our technical support specialists. And he's here to help with any technical issues that might come up today. And with that, I am pleased to introduce you to this month's speakers. First, Dr. Laura Pipe is the Director of Teaching and Learning at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She holds a BS in Journalism from Texas Christian University, an MS in Higher Post-Secondary Education from Syracuse University, and a PhD in kinesiology. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm sorry. From UNCG. Her scholarly and teaching interests focus on indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies, action sports such as bicycle, motocross, skateboarding, and stock car racing, and the construction of public or private space and issues in Native and Indigenous health. And Dr. Jennifer Stevens, who is the Director of Academic Residential Partnerships and an Assistant Professor of Education at Elon University. She holds a BA in Education from UNC Chapel Hill, an MS in Counseling from the North Carolina State University, and a PhD in Educational Studies with a concentration in Cultural Studies from UNC Greensboro. Her scholarly and teaching interests focus on teacher leadership, culturally responsive and critical place-based pedagogies, and curriculum development and design. So with all of that said, I am going to hand things over to them. And Laura, I am going to go ahead and make you the presenter.
This is the fun part where we all get to just watch you like stare at the screen and try to figure things out.
Making sure I picked the right one. Did I pick it? So you should be seeing the point slide and not.
I see your slide. Yep.
The chaos that is the desktop. Well, thank you all for coming. Jennifer and I are just so excited to share a little bit about what we learned in our work for the Ignite book that we'll share a little bit more about, but also I think to share and meet with so many people who are as interested in this conversation around decolonization and what it means for us in higher education as we move forward. So just we already did a nice little introduction of who we are. Thank you so much for that. But then also wanted to start us off with a brief land acknowledgement, but also to talk about why land acknowledgements are really important and when to do them and when not to do them. And so land acknowledgements have become very much something in vogue that a lot of us have taken up to do without really truly understanding the context of what a land acknowledgement is and why we do them. And a land acknowledgement really happens for a couple of different reasons. One, at the forefront, the really most important piece is it's signifying to your students and to others that you are committed to the work of supporting Native and Indigenous communities in your local space. But it also is letting Native and Indigenous students know that you see and value the reality that their connection to space and place is indivisible of their humanity and their ability to move and navigate in the world around them. And so I always remind folks, when you do a land acknowledgement, make sure it's not a hollow act, that it's not just a surface performative act, that you are actively interrogating your own work, your own engagement, your own connections to the local Native communities that you serve, that you're living and loving on their traditional homes. And so that is a commitment that a land acknowledgement is really showing, that you're committed to this labor and this work. On your screen right now, we have a link to the native-land.ca, which is really an interactive land map of Native communities. So you can actually search and research the communities that lived and continue to live on the land that you now occupy. Also at the bottom, there's another small link to several of these posters that you see here that were produced by the Arts Council. And it's several Native artists kind of rendition of this "You Are On Native Land" that you can actually use and insert the land that you occupy. Jennifer and I are in two different places right now. So Jennifer and I are both on land that kind of spans several Native nations that are here in North Carolina, and what is now known North Carolina, the Occaneechi, the Saponi, the Sarak, the Kiawe, and the Catawba nations. But I also wanted to share with you an Indigenous land acknowledgement. Oops. And this comes from the work of Corey Roberts, who's an Occaneechi linguist, who kind of floated this idea of an Indigenous Native land acknowledgement might look very different than those of us who are not of Native descent might have. And so I actually created my own Indigenous land acknowledgement. My family is of Tuscarora and Seneca descent, part of the Haudenosaunee Nation. And so pulling from really the values of the Haudenosaunee and the work we do, this is the land acknowledgement that I created and wanted to share with you today. Give thanks. We thank the land and creator for providing and caring for us, and we in turn care for the land. The land has existed since the sacrifice of the muskrat, who brought dirt from the ocean to be laid upon the turtle's back. The land existed before us and will exist after. Our choices today impact the generations ahead as we borrow the land from the next generation and the next. We honor our ancestors who respected and protected the land before us so that we may be cared for by the land and that we may care for the land today. Give thanks.
Thank you for that beautiful land acknowledgement, Laura. I think what's important to hold central in this conversation today is this importance of space, place, and culture and how that impacts the work that we do. And so we hope as we go through this presentation today that you think about your own place, the own context in which you are situated. Because part of decolonizing, right, the colonial practices are people from one place coming into another place and asserting some level of dominance and power over. So if we want to break that down or get out of that habit, how do we consider where we are situated and how we need to attend to our unique approaches because of the place and space in which we are situated? So we'll share some highlights and some insights from a variety of expertise and wisdom keepers who contributed to the book that you see on the screen there, Ignite. And these wisdom keepers were everyone from artists and storytellers and lyricists and graphic designers and faculty and undergraduate students, all sharing their insights as learners but all situated in different locales that really impact what that means for them personally and what that means for their work and engagement in the learning process. So we hope that you will consider your own spaces and places and personalize what we share with you today to your own context.
Oops, went too far. There we go. All right, so we actually wanted to get you started with this idea of why we're having this conversation around decolonization, because there's a lot of different ideas of what decolonization really means, and a lot of people are using the term decolonization without really realizing that they're not actually decolonizing. They're talking about very important work, but overlaying the term incorrectly. And so we want to start with just really talking about why this work is central and important to Jennifer and I, and how we started here. And we started with Marie Baptiste. I think she was the foundation of many of our conversations around why this work is so important, but particularly this idea of cognitive imperialism. And cognitive imperialism really is about this belief that the Eurocentric understanding of what wisdom looks like and what knowledge looks like and who gets to generate knowledge and how knowledge is validated is the only way to create and own and categorize and value knowledge, right? And that process of determining what knowledge looks like really stemmed from the Renaissance era in Europe, and it is based in an assumption that only Europe has a history, that everyone else on the whole globe has no historical context or positioning or knowledge generation of their own. And so the academy here in the US and in Canada is really built on this Eurocentric model of how we validate, how we produce, and how we understand what knowledge looks like. And it does so very much to the detriment of others. And so you can see here from Dr. Baptiste's quote, that it asserts a distinction between the lives that is of like a superior quality of life, that is the European mind and spirit, from those of others around them. And she specifically also talks about how cognitive imperialism denies the child and their subsequent heirs of that heritage, knowledge, and language in order to maintain a legitimacy of only one singular dominant knowledge system, right? One language, one frame of reference. And so what that means is that cognitive imperialism is really the foundation of what Annabelle Quijano calls the promise of modernity, right? And that is truly what colonization propagates, is that by going through this process of progress, right, by buying into what progress looks like, we are actually moving to a place of modernity. And modernity is this promise that if we buy into these very specific ideas of what knowledge looks like and how knowledge is produced and how it's valued and how we then value the labor that it comes out in turn, then we all as a society benefit. When in reality, only specific bodies in our society benefit. The rest of those bodies are considered working material, labor, expendable in many ways in the production of modernity of others. And so that brings us to this place of decolonization and de-Westernization. So as I said, decolonization right now is being applied in a lot of different ways, and there are many definitions of decolonization. So in order to apply a singular definition to that would in itself be a colonizing act. But in terms of the work Jennifer and I are doing, we've really centered our work on Annabelle Quijano's work, right? Because he was the original scholar to really coin the term decolonial and really put it out there. And he came from the mountains of Peru. That's where this work was really centered. And so the work of decolonization from that perspective is the labor of everyone, not just a singular group of people. So there are some folks who truly believe you cannot decolonize unless you're Native and Indigenous, and that you really need to be doing anti-settler work. There's other folks who believe that decolonization really is this broad brush of any type of anti-racist work. But in the context of our work, decolonization is really sitting at the root of how do we begin to disrupt that cognitive imperialism. And so that means then there's a difference between decolonization and de-Westernization. So de-Westernization is the idea of bringing in the content in a different way, so different knowledge systems, different perspectives, very diverse authors, right, into what knowledge looks like, but it's still structured within the colonial system, right, the colonial methodologies. So when you think of feminist scholarship, critical scholarship, right, those type of things still operate in this colonizing mentality of this is how we validate this scholarship, right? Peer review with certain types of education, with certain types of authors, but it doesn't necessarily stay with that very traditional Eurocentric view of the content. So what that means very in real terms for many of us who serve students is things like grading. I can disrupt how I grade, but I still have to submit a grade, right? So that disruption itself is a de-Westernized view, but the fact that I still have to work within the system of colonization means that I have to submit a grade. Versus decolonization is this complete restructuring of the container that is knowledge. So it's not just bringing in diverse authors and diverse ways of knowing, it's also saying the whole system that determines what is valid knowledge and valuable knowledge needs to be deconstructed and looked at differently. So when you think about institutions like Evergreen State, where their grading system is completely narrative, it's not a formal grade that's assessed onto the student's performance, that is a decolonizing perspective in action, right? So it's really thinking about how do we begin to change the entire structure of knowledge. And it's heavily focused on relationships. So European and cognitive imperialism and this colonial perspective heavily focuses in an epistemology of objects. So we study things, right? We study people as things, we study objects as things, we study things. Most decolonizing approaches, particularly indigenous approaches to epistemology, focus on the relationship between objects. So the relationship between a person and space versus studying the space, right? And so that really begins to shift our idea of decolonization versus de-Westernization, in that you can't divorce this promise of modernity and colonization from the conversation of decolonization. So Kehanu's work was really important for a lot of reasons, but Kehanu started to speculate if we can understand how colonizers colonize, and if that would help us in this disruption of that decolonial, that colonizing structure. And so he created what's become termed the colonial matrix of power. It's made very popular right now by Mignolo and Walsh's work out of Duke. Mignolo's an Argentinian scholar. And essentially what Kehanu found is that that colonization in the process is like a four-legged stool. And that four-legged stool starts with knowledge and subjectivity. And that means that knowledge and subjectivity does that defining of what knowledge looks like and what knowledge can be and who can possess it, just as much as it does this content of knowledge, right? All of the things that we're taught in a traditional formalized school setting is that knowledge and subjectivity. Then he said that moves into these other three areas. So how we define what knowledge looks like, who owns it, who has power over it, really begins to shape our understanding of who has authority in a society, who gets to make decisions in that society. That also makes really clear pathways for how labor is rewarded, compensated, valued, devalued, and even believed to and understood how to exist. And then it also shapes how we view gender and what counts as gender, what roles are associated with gender, and sexuality in those spaces. And they prop up the system of racism and patriarchy. Now, the piece about this that I think is so interesting is that many of us can look at our experiences and say, oh, I recognize that stool, right? I recognize that in very traditional ways, hear what it looks like. But we don't necessarily stop to think about the fact that we can shift and change what that stool looks like, so we can make it very modern, right? Have that very sleek look. And then we can also make it very abstract and very artistic. And then it becomes a little harder to recognize, but it's still that same stool, right? It still exists. And so the questions really become, how do we stop and pause and think about what are the characteristics of that colonizing colonial matrix of power, and how might we be adding to a reproduction of it? And where are the spaces where we can de-Westernize as a starting step to move towards a space of decolonization? Because many of us in higher ed, we're in situations where I can't fully decolonize. I can de-Westernize with the hope that when the institution is in a different place, I can move to decolonization.
So Laura mentioned how, I mean, we're born into these structures already, and how invisible they can be to us. And so Temujana Kun did some work around highlighting what some of these features of white supremacy culture are, so we can begin to recognize how this kind of colonial matrix of power shows up for us in the day-to-day, and the way that we engage within our environments, and whether that be consciously or subconsciously. In our interview with her for the book, Laura, if you'll go to the next slide just to show one of Tema's quotes, she talked about white supremacy being this kind of toxic death sentence for everyone, including white people who might benefit the most from these features of white supremacy or power over culture, because we all then are participating in these harmful, toxic behaviors, structures, experiences on a daily basis. And so when you think about where we are societally, and the amount of disconnect that exists, the tension that exists between people, the high levels of mental health challenges that we're experiencing, it's because something is just not sitting right with us as human beings. And so if we can begin to think about what are some of these things and how are we perpetuating them or participating in them, then we can look for opportunities to work in opposition to those. So on the screen, you see a variety of these features of white supremacy culture. I highly do recommend, you'll get these slides after the presentation. So visiting the website where she makes all of her literature available for free. So you can read more about it, but just thinking about your own context, where do you see this showing up in the practices and processes and structures at your own institutions and in your work with students, or just in your lives personally? Just to highlight a few of them. I mean, I think societally, we can see that a lot of this is based in fear, right? And so much of what we see in the context of politics and in the media is so fear-based that it's easy for us to be looking for others to blame, which further disconnects us from one another. This idea of that there's one right way to do things towards some sort of perfect end. We see that in the ways that we assess student learning, the ways that we engage with students about what their process or pathway needs to look like. This whole idea of like either or thinking, there's a right or a wrong, when all of us learn differently at a different pace and for different purposes. And that's difficult within the structures, these kind of colonizing structures that we have, where we want students to graduate in some sort of timely manner, often the 4 or 5 year graduation plan, but also holding to that reality of like there are valid reasons for that. We don't want students engaging in constant expense toward the goal that they have. and we want to help steward some sort of experience for them that they're aiming for beyond just the acquisition of the piece of paper. So there's a tension there, but just thinking about the ways that we operate in the gray rather than either or. This idea of individualism, that, you know, pull myself up by my bootstraps and I can make it on my own, failing to recognize the way that we are also interdependent, and the way that that whole campus community then impacts that kind of individual experience. This idea of progress, or this more or quantity over quality, and in regard to that, what we can objectively measure. So, you know, maybe it's how many students are visiting our tutoring center versus like the quality of that interaction that's happening between the tutor and the student. The worship of the written word versus like the many other forms of knowledge acquisition and knowledge sharing. And then this sense of urgency, which I think regardless of where people kind of fall on a political continuum, is very dangerous. And we're all ending up participating in this dangerous sense of urgency, where even people involved in social justice work can get so entrenched in this idea of urgency that we fail to bring everyone to the table as we need to, and we fail to create the space to pause and reflect on what's working and where we need to head next. So just reflect on those areas that might show up for you in your own work or in your personal lives, and where is some space for you to do things a little differently in counter to those features of white supremacy culture. With white supremacy culture and this colonial matrix of power being the foundation for these structures in which we operate, one thing that we see happens in the learning process is the movement away from actual learning built upon curiosity toward this transactional approach. And we see that the further learners are in a formal educational setting, we see that become more and more entrenched. So oftentimes, I mean, I think about my own child when entering school for the first time, the amount of curiosity, the questions, just the wonder about the world around them and everything that they were interested in, and how quickly, I mean, within the first couple years of formal schooling, that kind of went by the wayside, and it was a series of transactions. I have to do this, and then I do this, and I do this, and this is the particular outcome. I got to pass this exam. And that curiosity then leaves the learning process. But then what we'll see is like students will come to us and they're like, just tell me what I need to know to pass the exam. Tell me what I need to know to get the piece of paper. But then outside of the classroom, or once they graduate, this natural curiosity is there and it resurfaces, whether that's, for me, it was, having very little interest in my formal history courses because so much of my learning experience was memorizing dates and timelines. And yet outside of formal learning spaces, so interested in history. I will seek out documentaries. I will go visit historical sites. So that curiosity is there. How do we try to carve out space for students to tap into that curiosity so that they're not getting into the lifelong learning only outside of formal schooling? So we have this natural inclination to curiosity that's there biologically. We have studies cognitively. We have studies that show us how central curiosity is to our humanness. But if we don't carve out that space in schooling then just becomes a series of disciplinary canon, some sort of hierarchy of subjects. We've now identified that these particular areas of our core importance, never mind that we might be interested in many other things, or we have this set of standards or learning outcomes, and that's the sole focus. Never mind that your life journey might take you in a different direction. Laura, I know that you've done some work around Marie Baptiste and her view of the learning spirit and the creator. I wonder if you might tap into some of how that impacts our walk with curiosity.
Yeah, so in the previous slide, we talk about this move from the learner-centered approach that many of us, particularly those of us who went through higher education administration programs or student affairs personnel programs, we were told this is the way, right? We moved from student-centered to learner-centered. Learner-centered still is rooted in a system of paternalism, right? I'm still making decisions on behalf of what I think is best for my students. And the curiosity centered begins to move us to a space where the student's curiosity is driving the conversation. So when you go back to Tema's list, one of the pieces in there is that sense of urgency and that paternalism. When I talk with several Native students, and they've shared that one of their frustrations with some of the classes they took, particularly in STEM, was that when they had questions that wanted to go deeper or a different direction than where the content was prescribed to take them, they were told, oh, we don't have time for that, or we won't answer that here, or maybe you should have gone to a different type of institution that focused on that, particularly being told by some institutions they need to focus at an agricultural school if they want to learn about the land. When you think about where we started in this conversation, land and place being indivisible from their humanity and their being, right? To be told those things is very crushing to that spirit, right? And so that's where Marie Baptiste's work on the learning spirit, I think, sat with Jennifer and I in particular, at a time actually when Jennifer's oldest daughter was going from kindergarten to first grade, and she was watching this process happen in real time, right? That for the Mapekwe, the idea is that we are born endowed with a learning spirit that walks alongside us our whole lives, and it's our responsibility to engage with that spirit, feed that spirit, and help that spirit grow as we move forward. And so that really became the foundation of mine and Jennifer's work, and a model that we'll share with you in a moment, of this idea of what happens if, instead of us saying, I've got to get through this content, or I've got to get you through this advising process to ensure that you finish the checklist I need for you to graduate, or I need to get you through this service because this is the outcome. What if we stopped and said, what's your curiosity? What do you want that experience to look like? What are the things that excite you around this topic? And we let the learner really drive the bus of how we make decisions and do things, and that's going to change from student to student, right? So coming up with a singular process and having all of our students fit it is more about them navigating us than us providing them with support. And that takes us really to the foundation of all of this work. Even when we started up there with the difference between kind of a Western epistemology from an indigenous or decolonized epistemology, and then into Tema's work, is that we have to move from these very transactional relationships to much more of these authentic, reciprocal relationships based in trust. That is foundational, right? It acknowledges that the learner has come into that space with knowledge already that can be shared and that they can be owners and expertise and authors of. But it also brings us back to a space where we are not assuming that we are entitled to a student's trust. The last several years has taught many students that are coming through our doors that trust cannot be assumed. And so we still operate in a space where that authentic trust is entitled to us, and we are assuming that it exists, when in reality for our students, it's not just there. And so how do we get to a space where we move away from, let me get you through this process and this doorway and this next step, whether it be in the classroom and advising and career services and tutoring, right, in all these spaces, but we actually get back to a space of how do we engage them in a reciprocal way where they have their best opportunity to be successful because it's based in trust.
And I'll say doing that, and this is an important part of the work that Laura and I do, is like holding that in this very real space of tension. I talked about that tension a little bit ago when I was saying, you know, that we all learn at different rates, and yet the reality of our experience is that we want students to graduate, and we have a responsibility to help them graduate in a timely manner because of the expense and other reasons. So how is it that we can do both? And that is that space of what's Michelle Tanaka calls tender resistance. So we're both attending to the reality and these harmful effects of this colonial matrix of power and the white supremacy culture that is at the foundation and so intertwined in all of our structures, while at the same time creating that space, that hopefulness for what's possible, and giving students the opportunity to have some choice and some agency, so that, you know, we do have the realities, we have these structures, but how is it that we allow for some flexibility, some malleability within those structures? For me, I teach pre-service teachers. It is imperative to me to operate within this space because I am helping to prepare these students to go into a reality of a formal K-12 teaching environment, that I do them a disservice if I don't focus on the realities that they will face and how to engage within that reality. But at the same time, there's no way these future teachers are going to sustain a career in education if we don't also hold space for the hopeful. Where is it that they do have that power and that agency to create change within their own environments, to start to make those incremental changes to make their school community, their larger community, a better place? And so how is it that in our own work with learners, how do we operate in that space of tender resistance where we attend to both the realities of the world in which we operate, but also that hopefulness and that flexibility that responds to the individuality of the learner?
And so I think one of the tools in the toolkit that Jennifer and I landed on very, very early on in this work is the work of Tara Yoso and the community cultural wealth model that she presents. And so her work started with Latinx, Latinese students and looking at what their experience within the Western Academy really was and what was missing and what was absent. And she quickly found that there's a whole set of imperative capital that they bring with them that we ignore. We don't count, but we are completely dependent on. And I think COVID actually highlighted several of these when students had to use these capitals in different ways. And all of a sudden, our academies and our systems became very difficult for them to traverse in successful, meaningful ways. This model is really applicable, I think, to all of our lives, not just Latinx and Latinese students, but it really is foundational to a shift that has to happen in the academy. Many of our services that we provide students are based on a model that was created in the 1970s. And full disclosure, I was trained by Vince Tinto, so I know the research that he did that started that work. And even Vince would tell you, stop using it. It was done in the 1970s on white men. And first of all, no students look the same today as they did in the 1970s, but certainly we've diversified who has access in these spaces. And so those models were really built on creating disconnection from who students were in high school and making a clean break for who we need them to be in college. And that model doesn't work for a lot of reasons. One is they have a cell phone in their hand a lot of times. So they have an instant access. They're no longer waiting for somebody to call them on the house phone at the end of the hallway, right? But also the students who sit in front of many of us are not students who can really truly disconnect from those communities and be successful. Those communities are essential to their ways of knowing, being, making sense of the world. And so this cultural wealth model sits with 6 capitals that I think are extremely important. Social and familial capital. Those are those spaces where families and communities and those connective components to grounding us to who we are and our stories and our histories become really essential. Aspirational capital, I think, as Jennifer showed, in tender resistance. hope is essential to learning. That is the promise that needs to replace the promise of modernity, are these promises of hope in learning, right? And then linguistic capital, we as an academy penalize students who have to code switch between different languages, different dialects, different understandings of written and oral communication, and in a way that privileges a very colonized academic central way of communicating. And so you think about, if you have an international student, we often penalize them on their grammar. We often penalize them on sentence structure instead of really grading them on the content and context of their ideas. And if you're in a writing composition course, we're not necessarily giving them context for why they're enrolling in a writing composition course, and that context is, this is a space to learn very specific types of writing, right? We present it as the way to learn all writing, right? And so that linguistic capital often gets completely overlooked, but when they go into the world of work, they're going to be celebrated for their ability to code switch and navigate in those spaces. And that the idea of breaking them of certain colloquial and community-based language habits actually is in many ways disconnecting them from that community. They can't go home. So the example I often give is many Native students are sent to college by their community with the intention that they're going to come back and do work within the Native community, but those communities often have very distinct dialects of English. We break them of that habit. They go home, and that term of, well, you talk white or you act white becomes very quickly a way for them to no longer have access to the very things that they meant to serve. But then the last two, resistance and navigational capital, our entire system of the academy is built on their ability to navigate us. The navigational capital is how we've been successful up to this point, right? When a student is struggling, we say, why don't you go to tutoring? When a student is having a hard time, why don't you go to counseling, right? But we don't actively reach into them. We expect them to navigate us, to reach out and say, I need this support and I need this agency. And that takes a lot of trust on the student's behalf to disclose those needs, but it also assumes that we don't have to really put our hands in it. We don't really have to do any of that labor of saying, I'm noticing you're struggling, right? And so how do we shift away from exploiting that navigational capital? Because it was very much depleted during COVID.
So everything we've shared up to this point were really some of the ideas that Laura and I were wrestling with, and how this whole idea of trying to decolonize and de-Westernize the structures in which we operate, how abstract that can seem, or what a massive undertaking that can seem to be. And so we tried to conceptualize a way to reflect and approach our work that is non-prescriptive. So I do want to reinforce that we tried to put things in a digestible way, but not as a prescription, but just as a guidepost, so that you can consider ways that you can begin to reflect on your own practices and systems and structures, again, within your own space and place-based context. But that ended up becoming the part of the origin of what we call the TALS model, or the Toward a Liberated Learning Spirit model for developing critical consciousness, which ended up then being the way that we organized the Ignite book and the contributions from our many authors in that book, beginning with where our learners often begin with us, which is from this place of academic detachment. So we already talked about before how through the K-12 learning process, so much of their own innate learning spirit, their own innate curiosities are stifled in place of this transactional approach. What do I need to know? What do I need to do to pass this class, to move forward to the next grade? And so we start there. That's where our learners come to us. How do we begin to break that down and move toward something different, first it's exposing them to diverse perspectives, diverse ways of knowing and being, to include their own, the recognition that these students come with life experience. They already have expertise. They are the experts on their own lives, more so than us. So how do we work in cooperation with one another, embracing those narratives, creating that trusting space where students can begin to bring these diverse perspectives in and understand that there's multiple ways of walking in the world. Then we need to get them to that unlearning. We create opportunities for them to have some experiences that take them out of where they're situated and their own perspective and put them in some sort of unique situation that allows them to view the world maybe in a little bit different way, or to have an experience that might be counter to what their general experience has been up to that point. So then they're starting to internalize, like, okay, I'm wrestling with this thing that like feels different than everything I've ever known. What do I do with this? And you'll notice at the center is reflection, and that's because at all parts of this process, we constantly want that reflection to be present, so that they are making sense of what is happening as they're experiencing this now new way of learning that's counter to maybe what they've experienced in their previous like 13 years of schooling. And then oftentimes, if we do get there in a formal learning space, that might be the end of it, and we never really get to any space of applying that and putting that into action. So we try to consider the ways that we can put them in a space where they're having to consider what this means in a real world context. And so even like in a class, if we can't get the students out into the community doing some sort of community action project, can we make a plan? So what is an issue that is of particular importance to me as the learner, or a community that I really identify with or resonate with? And how would I imagine that I might engage within that community, applying these new lenses through which I'm seeing things in this new knowledge and context? And then from there, hopefully we have this transformation that happens where we're somewhat liberated with a new perspective. So the example that I always would give here for like this liberated learning is with me, like when I was shopping for cars. I could take a class on automotives. I would be totally disinterested in that. That's not a passion area for me. I would probably learn what I needed to know in that class to pass it, and then that would be the end of how I would engage with that content. However, when I need to use that type of knowledge, I learn it. So when I'm going shopping for a car, now all of a sudden I immerse myself in research around different types of vehicles. And what I start to see then when I purchased my last vehicle, which was a Nissan Altima, all of a sudden I see these things on the road everywhere. It's not that they weren't there before, it's just I never paid attention. But now, because I've immersed myself in this research and I ended up buying that car, now I see these cars on the road all the time. And that same thing can happen for us in learning. When we've exposed students to new ways of seeing things, they can't unsee it. And so it now becomes part of their consciousness. And then they could even revert back to, you know, if we're envisioning this in the context of a course, reverting back to where they started in a class with whatever readings or other information sharing happened, and they would see that through a new lens as well. So they can revisit prior experiences, they can revisit other forms of information and see it in a new light.
Yes, and so Jennifer and I quickly saw what this looks like in a classroom setting, but then also quickly saw what this meant in a programmatic way for folks who are doing other aspects of learning on a college campus, right? So for Jennifer and I we both came out of student services at different points in our career. So we've walked that middle line between a faculty and a staff member. And it is essential that we as campuses and institutions begin to think about teaching and learning and who is a teacher in very different ways, right? We are all teachers on a college campus, students, faculty, and staff. If every interaction we have, we approach through that both teaching and learning perspective, that we're in this reciprocal learning space, things in our academies would look so different. They would look amazing in different ways. And so for us, it was really important that we took this model and also thought about it in ways of how does it practically apply to the programmatic spaces that many of us do this work, right? We do the work of learning in a way that doesn't come in these kind of contained 16, 12, 7-week courses. And so that's when we kind of re-visioned what that model would look like in different language, right? And so this one does still start with detachment. We all start by learning what are the scholarly best practices in the way we approach the work we do. What's the student development theory? What's the best and latest practices in appreciative advising? What are the next practices and how we handle the programmatic living learning spaces that are housing and residence life, right? We look at what's out there in a scholarship way and we examine it and think about what does that mean for the work we're doing, right? That's that academic detachment, applying that language and that work in our own context. But then we have to also start thinking about the conversations we're having with students, the conversation we're having with colleagues. How do we examine what the student experience looks like and how the student experience really engages with those practices? And then we start to make changes, right? So we focus on that relationship. This is where reflection becomes a key central point to every stage. Reflection is also not only the space where we wrestle with new knowledge and how that new knowledge gets incorporated into how we want to live and work and be, but it also becomes a safe space to do some really challenging work of interrogating how we've approached the world before, right? And so this work's at a focus on relationship. Then we move into unlearning, and this is an opportunity to look at how are other people thinking of these things that maybe are not in the scholarship, that are not considered best practice, but they're effective, they're working. How do we begin reaching out to others and really seeing what other campuses are doing? Jennifer and I did this through campus visits. Every time we go to a conference, we email some colleagues in that space and say, hey, can we spend some time with you? Because we just want to see what other people are working towards. And much of Tal's in the Ignite book actually came out of Jennifer and I were able to go visit the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii on Oahu. And Jennifer will share a little bit more with that, but that shifted our thinking on some of the labor we do, right? So it came out of these opportunities to visit colleagues and see what they were doing and experience what those things were. And then we move into how do we provide opportunities? So how do we start to apply this to the systems and processes and approaches that we do at our own institutions, right? How do we interrogate those policies? How do we begin to think about them differently? And then we start to incorporate and advocate for changes within our larger disciplinary structures, right? So we start to become the ones who produce that scholarship. We start to be the ones to advocate for difference and change happening in these spaces, for new best practices to emerge. And then we start that circle all over again. And so one of the things that we were really fortunate in Ignite to do is we had several people write a good spectrum of different type of ideas down. So like Jennifer said, we had some traditional scholarship, but we also had artists and students and folks to write. And this comes from one of our students who wrote in the book. And she's talked a lot about her like K through 12 schooling versus college, because she did not go to a K through 12 school. She did what she lovingly called unschooling. It was very much that traditional space of sitting at the feet of elders within the Native community that she grew up on and gleaning from their stories, right? And so she shared in that conversation about how jarring the college environment was. Asking for help became different and difficult. Getting support became difficult in many ways. But she really compared that this idea that all of a sudden she went from a beautiful, bountiful buffet of food to a hot dog eating contest. How did she get the most amount of information in the fastest amount of time in a most unfulfilling way, but also move quickly through that process. And this is a student that was incredibly successful at navigating the academy. She is now a PhD, MD student at Mount Sinai and turned down some very, very prominent institutions to go to Mount Sinai, which in itself is a pretty prominent institution. So it's not that the traditional academy is difficult to navigate, it was unfulfilling.
So also in Ignite, we had British storyteller Jenny Moon, former formal educator as well, who told a story, and this is a piece of artwork that's in the book that she created as well, a folk tale that gets at the way that our learning is shaped by the perceptions, and the ways that our perceptions are shaped by the experiences and the structures around us. And so I won't get into the whole story of this folktale, but in general, the people go out on a quest, they have a particular task to achieve, they think they've achieved it because they don't have all the diverse perspective on what has occurred, and then only in reflection later as a community are they able to come to some level of understanding and some importance. So how do we carve out that space in our engagement with students as well? First off, just benchmarking their perceptions. Where is it that they're starting from? How is it they are perceiving their experience, what their goals are, how they anticipate their future plans? That incorporation of narratives, talking to students about their story, getting to know some about them. That way you're also building in that navigational and other capital that they're coming in with, and you can build on that as they are going through their formal educational experience. Laura talked about interrogating, so giving space for students to do some internal reflection where they really are wrestling with, okay, how is it that I came to how I perceive things, how I walk in the world? How is that lining up or not with what I'm experiencing now? Where do I go from here? And then having that space for that reflection also provides that comfort that that's part of the learning process. We're constantly in this tension of seeing like what's working or not for us, what's sitting right or not for us right now, and where is it that we go next. Jenny Moon has a kind of sequencing of reflection that we want to think about as we work with students as well. So the first is just noticing. So like, oh, like that was an idea. That just being aware that like, okay, this thing's a little different for me. And then next, trying to make sense of that. So what exactly is this thing telling me? What does that mean? Making meaning of it. So really coming to some sort of understanding about like, okay, now I have a sense of what that means. What does that mean within a certain context? Working within that context for themselves, so working with that meaning, and then as they have worked with and wrestled with that understanding within their own context, then that's where we start to see some sort of shift in worldview. Our students are not good at reflection. So how can we, as we are working with students, help to scaffold this reflective experience? Because so much has been transactional, and because of things like the white supremacy culture that says like, you should fear making a mistake. You should be able to come to the right answer, this one right answer. There is a perfect end to this situation. Taking time for true reflection and the messiness of it all is not something that students are accustomed to. So how is it that we can get students to notice what it is that they're experiencing, to make sense of it, to put it in their own context and wrestle with it, and then kind of reflect back to us what that means for their next step. So thinking about the ways that you might incorporate reflection in this context within your own spaces.
And one of the pieces I think all of us can say, if you look at students today and the world we live in today, many of the things that we face globally are because we don't stop to reflect and think through things. We move in that sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency has in many places of the Academy made reflection busy work for students, like that, oh, I'm supposed to give you a summary of what we talked about or a summary of these events. They haven't been taught what reflection truly is. So in my classroom setting, I actually spend time on this graphic, and I also build it into their reflection so that I can say we're moving from making sense to making meaning. Now we're moving from making meaning to working with meaning. I expect you to be able to pull in context from life experience and other courses in order to get to this place, right? And then in a service space, I share this with faculty when we do faculty development, right? This is an opportunity for you to move from just making sense of this concept or this pedagogy or this process to one that's much more down the line for how you're going to put it into action and play. And so as you begin to do your work with students, it's helping them begin to understand, how do I reflect in each one of these interactions? How do I reflect in my advising appointment on where I want to go and how these things mean for the next steps of where I want to be? And those housing interactions, how do I reflect on these behaviors and these choices in ways that can help me build and bridge? One of the ways that I do that in some of the classes and conversations that I have is by using some of these initial and prompting questions and things to consider. And I think Jennifer and I originally were going to ask you to do some of these, and I still encourage you to do so, but in the interest of time, we won't go quite that far. But these last two, these promptings and considerations, is where I really get when I start to support students and where they want this academic life to fit in a much larger picture of their life. I get them to start thinking, what does that learning spirit or that curiosity look like for you? What does that look like when it's in action? How do you feel? How do you sit in it? How do you sit differently? How do you engage in it, right? And then start to imagine and think about, what does learning actually look like for me if my curiosity is driving that, if my curiosity is driving the direction that I go. And then all of a sudden, things like advising are no longer a checklist, right? Because if my curiosity is driving the conversation and I'm sitting in tender resistance, I know I've got things to get done, but the places where I have choice, I might make different choices. Leading to another student who wrote and shared in the book, who was an undergraduate student, she talks about this reciprocal nature of how we have to start to believe that our students already have experiences that they've learned from, and that those experiences have to be part of the conversations we have of how we support them. Mays and Mead, who is a neuroscientist, did a lot of work on what the brain looks like when it's dealing with past trauma, but she also talks about learning trauma as part of that. We picked up things along the way in our experiences within an education system that immediately shape, as Jennifer said, how we enter a learning environment. So for our students, somebody might have along the way said, you're really bad at math. And now every time they're presented with a math problem, that's the space they sit in, and we have to get them to move past it, right? And Mays has done great work of showing, like, literally the brain is sitting in the memory spaces in those moments. But you think about all the other places where students have to engage with us. So their conversation around tutoring might have been, you only go to tutoring if you're failing a course, not you go to tutoring to practice concepts that you know are going to be difficult, right? So we have to move them through that past experience. They may have always seen advising through the lens of a guidance counselor doing very specific, narrow things. We have to move them from that to understand what these services actually are. But we also have to acknowledge and legitimize that those experiences are significant parts of their learning already. I get super
building off of that, the creating spaces in our own learning environments where we are getting to know the students and hearing their narratives and their expertise and experiences, and using those in the ways that we shape our own policies and practices and procedures. So Simanshi did some amazing cartoons in the book that are, it's called Rejected Passport Photos. She's from Turkey, and these passport photos, hilarious, but also address like some of the challenges and the barriers that she faces in her international travel and as an international educator. But then also the ways that we can think about this as a metaphor in our own spaces. So you think about international students and the ways that we might support them on our campus is like helping them to fit into whatever sort of procedures and processes and structures that already exist. Obviously, we have larger federal and state requirements, you know, that we're probably not going to change in the immediate sense. So we do have to be, again, in that tender resistance, attentive to reality. But on our own campuses, rather than starting from that place, like, you know, you're an international student, you need to do X, Y, Z here, can we listen to students so we can have our own experience of unlearning? What are the barriers and challenges that they're experiencing trying to navigate our university? What sort of adjustments can we make to better support those students in their ability to navigate our university? In turn, that reduces the barriers for access to all of our students. So the ways that we can learn from our students to shape the actual policies and procedures that we have. Laura mentioned that we had the opportunity to go to Hawaii to the Polynesian Cultural Center, and that really did help to raise some questions for us about the ways that we approach things on our own campuses. At the University of Hawaii at Manoa, they were wonderful to let us come to their new faculty orientation. And we saw the ways that they begin to teach some of the indigenous language of the community there as guests to that native community and being occupants of that native land, how they're attentive. It's a Western education system, but how can they be really attentive and good stewards of the land and the community there while they're in that space? The Polynesian Cultural Center, we had the wonderful experience of seeing a native Hawaiian student who was a student at a formal Westernized education program, BYU Hawaii, biology major, but he was doing a presentation on wayfaring, and he was talking about the learning that has been passed down over generations in his community, but the ways that this value of the written word, written text from scholars from outside the community tried to tell them their origin story coming from the West. But they have these stories that have been passed down over generations and song that's told them that they came from the East. But everyone would believe what was in the written word versus what had been passed down generations in these communities. And so what was really remarkable watching this student, and that led Laura and I to ask questions and engage in these conversations with other students working at the Polynesian Cultural Center, was that we got to see him walking in this space with both perspectives side by side. So he was able to participate in this Western formalized structure, question it, also appreciate the value of some of what he was learning without devaluing this knowledge he knew to be true from the wisdom of his own community. And so how is it that you can walk with those things side by side? And Laura and I had the chance to talk with this Maori educator who gave this example of looking at a tree. And so one person looks at the tree and they see it as a leisure spot where they can hang a hammock and relax. Someone else looks at it as a source of firewood, while someone else looks at it as a source of food. And a Maori child would look at it as the tree is my brother. And how so much in Western education is about saying, who's wrong in this scenario? There's a right answer here and everybody else is wrong. When we can hold all of these things, all of these perspectives is equally valuable. And so how is it that we create this space in our own learning spaces where these multiple perspectives and life experiences can be equally valued and held up? And so one of the ways that we try to do that, based on the work of Dr. Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, some of trying to take that unlearning and put it into applied action was creating this creative tension. So you think about the bus boycotts. It was really easy for people to ignore what was happening until they were forced to face it through some sort of tension. So if this idea of us being endowed with these kind of natural gifts and talents and the different pace of learning means that those things are going to be activated at different times, but most typically when we need them, when we're faced with a particular life decision or situation, how is it that we can continue to support students, but do so in a way that allows them to face some challenges, some difficulty on their own, so that they have to activate those natural gifts and talents, and even the learned gifts and talents and skills and knowledge that they've acquired. So they have to activate that and put that into practice. And so thinking about your own context, where is it that we might be too quick to try to rescue a student versus like, how can we allow them a healthy struggle where they can actually like utilize some of the capital that they have, the natural gifts that they already have, to put those into practice?
And then just to end us, because we'll be right at 2:15, we want to give you 15 minutes to be able to ask some questions. I wanted to end with, what does liberation look like in action? And I think Jennifer and I, and anybody who's spent any time in that liberation space, will tell you liberation is the hardest to define, because much like decolonization, it's this abstract existed space, right? But I think Marie Baptiste really gives us some concrete spaces here to look at, right? This idea that we need to develop our own critical consciousness, our own, that own space where you now only see Nissan Altimas everywhere you go, right? You're seeing all of these spaces where our students are being told their very humanity is not valid because it does not fit this very standardized, colonized way of what existence and knowledge look like. And then start to ask questions about the inequalities that we sit in and we exist in, and that we navigate and we live in the very systems that we ourselves are asked to produce and reproduce. And then also to really shine light on those spaces where if we're inconsistent with what we say we want to do and who we want to be and what we're actually doing, and how those very assumptions really start to create harm instead of the good that we're hoping to do in our spaces of learning. So I think we want to just thank you so much for spending this time with us today, and open it up to any questions that you might have that we might be able to help or answer. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And thank you both. That was an incredible presentation. We do have a couple questions, and of course, if anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to put that into the questions box. But the first question is, in the colonial matrix of power, why is gender / sexuality emphasized over other aspects of subjectivity, for example, race, which are also central to colonization?
So one is when he was writing it. So Keanu really wrote this in the 1970s. You think about, as a society, we're kind of in that first wave feminism space. But the other place is, for Keanu, racism is rooted in all of those other spaces, right? So those 4 items prop up our whole understanding of what race is, and how we defined it and how we navigate within it. It props up a system of racism and patriarchy, but it's how we define whose labor counts and who labor isn't, and who plays what role, which is really what he's getting at in that gender space, really becomes central to that idea of how that system is propped up.
Awesome, thank you. And then this was just a comment that I thought was worth highlighting. This idea of the learning spirit and encouraging curiosity reminds me of when what we ideally do in tutoring, which is usually one-on-one and learner-centered. So I thought that was definitely a comment worth highlighting. And then another question, in the liberated learning model, does it matter where you start on the cycle for learner development?
So I'll let Jennifer share a little bit too, but I think all of our students and many of us are entering in that space from the East. We chose a circle because Indigenous pedagogy rooted much of this conversation, and walking that circle becomes really essential. But you really got to take into account where the person that you're working with is coming in. They may have already done some of that work. You may have done some of that work with them. And so you may be able to move to a different place in the circle, but you're not going to get through that whole circle in a really finite time block, right? So when we do talk about this with faculty and they do course design, they're like, I'm going to do all 4 of them in 16 weeks. And Jennifer's like, no, you're not. Like that might be a whole program, right? Of seeing a student for 4 years. It's, and there's places you go back and forth within that circle as well, but the aim is really to walk that circle in clockwise and then continue to walk it over and over again.
Yeah, I think just to highlight, again, it's not prescriptive, but it is based on multiple experiences and perspectives and kind of this consolidation of like, what were we seeing across the work that was happening in various social justice spaces, whether in class spaces or spaces in the community. And so that's a typical cycle that you'll see. And like Laura said, most of us do come from that place of detachment, especially in higher ed environments, where so much of this kind of natural inclination to tap into our curiosity, to take some healthy risks and trial and error has been squeezed out of the experience. But no, it's not prescriptive. And so you will have people entering in different phases. I've had the privilege of facilitating a scholarship program, a 4-year scholarship program for undergraduates. We do have courses connected to. And so I've been fortunate enough to see students go through the larger cycle and multiple iterations of that throughout their 4 years. If I only had them for 1 semester, or I met with them for 10 tutoring sessions or something, I probably am not going to observe the whole thing. So that's another part as an educator, being okay with the idea that you might not see the outcome. And that's also part of that tension as well, is because there is that pressure to assess in a certain time frame. So at the end of my 10 tutoring sessions, this should be the outcome, when what I've had the privilege to see working with students longitudinally is that they might get there, but it may take a while. It may take longer than that 10 weeks or than that 15-week semester. So being okay with the fact that like you might be planting a seed, a process may be beginning in your learning experience with that student, but you may not see the fruits of that unless you're fortunate enough to see them again, or they come back and share that impact with you. And because I stay engaged with so many of the alums from that program, I mean, for some of them, that seed's planted, but it doesn't bloom until they're like out in the field. And then they come back and say like, oh my gosh, this, like, we started talking about this in my first year of college, but it doesn't really resonate. Again, going back to when we activate that knowledge and those talents until they're put in those situations where they actually have to use it and engage.
All right, and I see a couple folks have hands up. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Keith, who looks like has his hand up, and then Michelle, you will be next. Let me unmute. But while we're waiting for that, here we go. Send unmute request. I just want to raise another question. Read this other question that's a little more rhetorical. How can we multiply / clone you both? We need you at our university. So we're getting some really great compliments in the. We're getting some really great compliments here. Request to unmute. So Keith, if you do want to unmute yourself, please feel free to do so at this time. And in the meantime, I want to go ahead and share this link to, I think it's today's presentation, and we'll also send this out. We'll also offer this link with our recording to everybody. This is the link to the slides. And then if you are interested in a free semester trial of academia, you can contact me, and I'm putting my email here in the chat as well. But Keith, if you do have any questions, feel free to email that to me, and I can pass that along to our speakers. It doesn't look like we have any other questions right now, so I think we are going to go ahead and close out for today. And again, we will be sending out the recording, and if you do have any more questions, please feel free to pass that along to us. And I want to thank Drs. Pipe and Stevens for being with us today. This has been such a great presentation. We really appreciate your time. And if you are able to take that quick survey for us to help us get that feedback, it would be really helpful. Just you take a few minutes to fill that out. But I want to thank everyone for coming today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor of being with you all.
Thank you
Absolutely.
for sharing space.
Thank you, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.